I will say again, welcome to everyone here and welcome to Dr. Michael Méndez. Take it away, please.
Thank you, Professor Reddy. It's such a pleasure to be here this afternoon or this evening, depending where you're at in the country. It's a great program, and I was really thrilled to get the invitation to speak to you about the social implications of science technology and its interface with the public policy and social equity world. So my background, as your professor mentioned earlier, is not only based in an academic background on environmental policy, issues of climate change expertise, but also really grounded in the political side, understanding how do we enact more sustainable, more just type of solutions to climate change and our environmental problems that lead with equity. So it's just not enough to have a great technological solution and technologically driven solutions. So we see great projects like, you may have read the book Project Drawdown, which has hundreds and dozens of solutions to rapidly decarbonize our planet and our economy. But there's social implications. Not all these solutions are going to be uniformly distributed equally and have the same type of benefits and the consequences in every single community. So my work really looks at that intersection of equity, or what we call environmental justice, of how the environment, how our decisions, or how our policies, how our technology, how our scientific practices are disproportionately, either intentionally or unintentionally, racially discriminating against certain demographic groups, both based on their race, or their class, their gender, immigration status, or sexuality. So environmental justice looks, how can we remedy these forms of environmental racism or environmental discrimination in our policies and practices around the environment and our development of our cities, towns, and communities. So I'll be speaking about my work in the California State Legislature and as an academic. I recently published a book earlier this year with Yale University Press, and it's called Climate Change from the Streets. This is my book cover, How Conflict and Collaboration Strengthen the Environmental Justice Movement. So this research is focused on 15 years of research and policy practice, where I engage actively with policymakers, experts, businesses, scientists, and of course, environmental justice activists to make sure California's global leadership on climate change, California is considered a global leader on climate change, really leads with equity. So as many of you know, throughout California and throughout the West, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis and a historic racial unrest. In the last several months, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters: fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These are all major life events. In the last several months, 5 of the 10 largest wildfires by acreage in California's history occurred in the last few months. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, economic, social, and economic impacts. Due to existing structural inequality in society, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. To address the climate emergency, activists and policymakers have proposed the Green New Deal at the federal level. It's a radical proposal to decarbonize our economy and address poverty and inequality. However, for the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and have been often met with significant resistance. While I'm supportive of the Green New Deal, I'm also here to say that there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like California since 2006 have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists and other scientific experts who favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. These conflicts over climate change are cultural at their core. They illustrate that although the science of climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions are claimed to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships, and all the competing interests and power struggles and racial dynamics that this implies. If we look towards the example of California, it reveals the contingent nature of climate policy, the assumptions and social, political, and cultural attitudes that often create conflict between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down conceptualization of climate change. In California, tensions between different approaches to addressing climate change are often centered on the politics of scale, class, economics, and race. These differences in worldviews, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust, even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm climate change will do to human societies and our planet. For insight into national level conflicts between groups working on climate solutions, one should look to the nearly 2-decade California experiment of incorporating environmental justice and health equity principles into climate change policy. For environmental justice activists in California, the main threat from climate change is the disproportionate harm it causes to their bodies and to the health of their communities. For them, climate change is not just about greenhouse gas models and science, rather it is also about opposing worldviews to which policy and science is seen. So this idea of embodiment, that the way in which we relate to the environment, the way we relate to the changing environment is embodied through our bodies, through our health, through our families, through our children. And this is also represented in our values and how we implement different scientific approaches to these problems. Yet in California, is often seen as a homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural setting. It also obscures how the localization of environmental policy and science within the state involves processes of public consultation and legitimacy. So typically when you think of California, you think of, surfers, people driving Priuses, and that we all care about environmental issues. And there's a really strong traditional narrative. That's a very strong traditional narrative of California that really erases people of color in enacting comprehensive environmental policy and leadership. For example, there was this recent book by a major university press of California that touts California's global leadership on climate change and other sustainability environmental issues. And it's described as a definitive book on California's environmental history and leadership. Yet in this 300-page book that has won awards, people of color are only mentioned twice, and then a third time as a footnote. So there's an erasure of people of color enacting comprehensive environmental policy. So therefore, I published my book, Climate Change from the Streets, with the explicit focus on people of color. And my book foregrounds people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality. This research in my book originated in my public policy work for California state legislature during a 15-year period. This provided me valuable insight into how the interactions of governments, businesses, experts, and NGOs shape climate change policy. My research is further influenced by my experience growing up in Latino immigrant communities of Los Angeles that face multiple environmental threats. At the youth in places like Pacoima and Arleta, I was surrounded by people resisting environmental racism, whether protesting the siting of landfills or organizing to demand the cleanup of toxic properties. They sought to understand how these situations originated, to develop alternatives, and to imagine new environmental futures. This has focused my work on what the conceptualization of environmental justice and climate change has meant to activists, policymakers, experts, and scholars alike. Understanding this is important because the idea of environmental justice has been growing in scope beyond its initial application to the inequitable distributions of hazardous waste dumps in poor communities of color. My work analyzes the expansion of environmental justice policy discourse and the ways in which it has challenged definitions of nature, science, and society. When I began this research project in California, I was struck by the lack of scholarship on the narratives of environmental justice in the context of climate change and their influence. The literature shows a real neglect of environmental justice groups' worldview and influence in climate change policy arena. The lack of a narrative perspective is largely due to the fact that, that since the 1980s, environmental justice studies have sought to legitimize itself as a serious area of academic inquiry. The first generation of environmental justice scholars in general focused on causality and quantifying environmental inequality through the lens of race and class at a single scale. However, an emerging second generation has extended the field to incorporate a deeper consideration of critical theory and intersectionality, the ways in which gender, class, sexuality, race, immigration status, and other categories of difference shape environmental justice struggles at multiple scales. This second generation has been dubbed critical environmental justice studies, and it focuses on 4 key important questions that are central to my own work. The first question asks, how does intersectionality, multiple forms of difference, again, race, class, gender, sexuality, immigration status, and how do these multiple forms of difference influence environmental justice outcomes? The second asks, to what extent should scholars focus on a single scale or multi-scale analyses of the causes and possible resolutions to environmental justice struggles? Third, to what degree do state power and market systems entrench social inequality? And then fourth, how can marginalized groups whose participation is indispensable to society shape sustainable and collective futures? Therefore, using this critical environmental justice study lens, the main argument in my book is for society to successfully resolve the phenomenon of climate change, critical attention must be placed on the human dimensions of climate policymaking, such as local knowledge, culture, and history, and at multiple scales. Central to this argument is a demonstration that environmental protection and improving public health are uniquely linked, and maintaining that link is key to advancing future climate action policy. So this idea is looking on the social and human dimensions of climate policy and science, and looking at how do we expand in multiple types of knowledge, not just focusing on the knowledge of scientists and experts, but also valuing the culture, the history, and the local knowledge of community residents that are being exposed to toxic air quality and other types of environmental pollution, and that they provide their own embodied knowledge that can be central to solving the climate change crisis. The case of California is particularly productive as a case to analyze these human dimensions of climate change policy and practice. As the world's 5th largest economy and the only US state to implement a comprehensive program of regulatory and market-based mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, California has consistently been at the forefront of broader national and global environmental experimentation. The state's cap and trade program, a central market-based mechanism for ensuring carbon emission reductions, is the 3rd largest in the world after the European Union and China. The program has been especially contentious in debates within California. Supporters emphasize its global reach and cost effectiveness, and detractors criticize its inequitable effects on specific local communities and demographic groups. California's prominence in climate policy makes it an ideal place to investigate the dynamics of such disputes and their roots in differing climate change worldviews. My multi-sided ethnographic policy analysis weaves together cases that are 3 unique cases that are interconnected. The first looks at climate and public health activism in 2 heavily impacted communities of color, Richmond and Oakland, California. The second looks at conflict over state-level carbon trading and use of its revenue for investment in local communities most harmed by air pollution. And third looks at international and local implications of forest conservation projects in the global south and Mexico and Brazil allowed under California's market-based climate change laws. These cases combine to reveal the contested politics of the local, state, and transnational levels on which California makes climate change policy and takes action. And this is multi-scalar or multi-sided, as I mentioned, because as I started to do this project and followed activists as they moved between policy scales and geographies, I saw that they were moving simultaneously between Richmond and Oakland, Sacramento, and the global south. For instance, activists in Richmond, California has the largest oil refinery, the Chevron refinery west of the Mississippi. And that Chevron refinery also happens to be the single largest greenhouse gas emitter in the entire state of California. So activists there are working with the city council and and other elected officials to address these inequitable environmental impacts that are happening primarily to people of color. This is 2/3 of people of color live in Richmond. But these activists understand that there's larger structures, political, social, and economic structures that have caused these environmental inequities in Richmond. So they also know they have to work simultaneously at the state capitol. California is a global leader, has the 3rd largest cap and trade system after the European Union and China. And this cap and trade system and climate change programs are really oriented towards the national and the global, not with much focus at the local level, particularly in the early years. So they work in Sacramento to try to rescale California's climate change programs to focus back on disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities like Richmond. At the same time, they understand that California is a global leader, that it sees itself like a nation state, and providing global leadership on climate change, and it has aspiration to link its cap and trade system to the global south in terms of forest conservation projects in Chiapas, Mexico, and Acre, Brazil. And this extension of the cap and trade program to Mexico and Brazil has been met with a lot of conflict and contention between with indigenous rights groups there that feel that conservation projects in California in their countries is going to create dispossession of land and displace indigenous tribes, as well as environmental justice groups that don't want to allow companies like Chevron to buy their way out of reducing pollution back home in Richmond. I'll be speaking more in depth in a few moments on that Global South case study. Therefore, this multiscalar research has 3 aims. The first is to demonstrate that public health and environmental justice perspectives can be central to successful climate change policy development and implementation. Second is to offer an interdisciplinary framework for theorizing the kinds of negotiations between scales and worldviews that are involved in the development of equitable climate change policy. And finally, to provide a set of findings that activists can use to negotiate with governments that legitimizes their perspectives about the differential impact of climate change on disadvantaged communities, both locally and globally. So, quick note on my methods. As a multiscalar case study, my work draws on 2 main sources: notes from my years observing policymaking and the Sacramento State Capitol, and extensive interviews with climate policymakers and environmental justice stakeholders from 2012 to 2015, with several follow-up interviews in 2017 and 2018. My participant observer reflections, content analysis, and semi-structured interviews provide valuable information on the conflicts and collaborations defining climate change and environmental justice in California. Now for the case study in the Global South and how California's climate change programs are trying to go global. So many of you are in the science field. Some of you may be natural scientists that are strong, or foresters that are strong proponents of forest conservation projects, which is good until itself. But I also want to ask that you have an open mind about this this case study and take this as an opportunity to understand why environmental justice groups are opposing such type of projects, even though they're helping the environment in the Global South, and understanding the modes, the logics, and the practice of environmental justice. So this case study here is one of the major case studies from my book, and here we'll be jumping scales from the local to the global. We will see how the conceptualization of environmental justice as an organizing theme has spread horizontally throughout California, and how it is now vertically linked to the Global South and Mexico and Brazil. For California advocates, there has been a growing need to develop a global consciousness in the environmental justice movement. Activists recognize the importance of connecting local agendas with trends they see nationally and internationally around climate change. In this case study, I examined how continued collaboration, experimentation, and coalition building since 2010 have brought California environmental justice perspectives to the global stage. The story centers on the ways in which carbon markets can create international links between local injustices and prompt new forms of translocal activism. A central figure in this story is Mary Rose Turuk, an activist with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN for short, one of the leading environmental justice groups in California, and it's also based in Richmond, California. Interesting, her indigenous last name in Tagalog means to know. According to Mary Rose, the need to engage on a global scale became clear when APEN's Native American allies who represent sovereign nations were participating in United Nations debates on climate change policy. Native American advocacy groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network developed campaigns that brought US environmental justice groups to United Nations and other global spaces. In these arenas, California environmental justice groups learned how linking their local campaigns also could help Indigenous groups in the global South. Their interactions laid a strong foundation for new translocal efforts when California attempted to link its cap and trade system to Chiapas, Mexico, and ACTA, Brazil through forest offset credits. Carbon offsets allow California's polluting industries to pay someone else anywhere else in the world to reduce their emissions by engaging in activities such as forest conservation. Forest offsets are also known as reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, or RED for short. In other words, RED offsets allows pollution at home only if developing countries keep their forests in the ground and do not use their own natural resources. Polluting industries in the United States are allowed to continue to pollute, most often in low-income communities of color like Richmond and Oakland. California's traditional environmentalists, such as the Environmental Defense Fund, the Nature Conservancy, polluting businesses, and some large indigenous groups. These are indigenous formally recognized by their state government that have formal land title to their lands and therefore more negotiation, support such offset projects because of cost effectiveness, ecological enhancements to tropical forests, and benefit sharing opportunities for indigenous communities. These groups stress the need to combat tropical deforestation, that is the cutting and burning of trees to convert land to grow crops, extract oil, or raise livestock. It is estimated that such activities account for over 20% of the Earth's human-caused carbon emissions. Polluting industries in particular support forest offsets in the global South because they are a significantly cheaper option for reducing carbon emissions when compared to domestic mechanisms. For California environmental justice groups, it seemed that RED offsets likely would not address local air pollution back home. They foresaw increased emissions in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Smaller indigenous rights groups in ACTA and Brazil, these are smaller groups that are not formally recognized by their state governments and do not have formal land title to their lands, argued that the new value of pristine forest reserves could motivate landowners to evict forest-based indigenous communities, especially in regions like Chiapas, where there is a long history of violent conflict over land rights. To them, RED could exacerbate local environmental problems and perpetuate historic injustices. Thus, in response, a new translocal coalition between South and North social movements emerged. Here we see how notions of environmental justice travel and are horizontally linked. This translocal coalition moreover argues for a systems thinking or a feedback loop approach to climate change policy. For example, they claim US imports of crude oil from the Amazon are driving the destruction of some of the rainforest ecosystem's most pristine forest areas and releasing large amounts of greenhouse gases. According to an Amazon Watch study, American refineries processed over 230,000 barrels of Amazon crude oil a day. And California represents a large majority, an average of 171,000 barrels, comprising 74% of all Amazon crude imports to the US. For Mary Rose, a hostile incident solidified her determination against RED offsets and towards a systems thinking approach for climate change policy. At a 2010 United Nations conference in Cancun, Mexico, she was detained and tossed out of the climate negotiations for holding a sign opposing carbon markets. She was quoted as saying, "You would think I would be afraid after that experience, but actually I was encouraged because to the right of me at the protest was the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, and to the left of me were leaders of social movements from the Western Hemisphere, from the MST of Brazil and the Via Campesina of Mexico. And in front of me were Native American brothers and sisters from the Indigenous Network who have been campaigning to end red forest offset," end quote. Working together in person and via conference calls during 2011 and 2012, California environmental justice groups and indigenous rights groups organized an opposition campaign. Through this process, they were able to overcome concerns of groups from Mexico and Brazil that California environmental justice groups might sell them out through carbon market trading and revenue sharing opportunity programs. After several collaborative negotiations, they eventually forged a common understanding about the spatial implications and global reach of California's carbon market, highlighting potential harms of those living among the trees and those living next to polluting industries. This debate is so contentious because California has the third largest carbon market in the world, after, again, the European Union and China. The implication here is that California is a global climate leader, and if California adopts RED, others will follow. While policymakers in California proclaimed the benefits of forest offsets at international events, several indigenous rights groups from the global south protested the lack of consultation during the development of a proposal that could impact their lands and livelihoods. The first major global protest against California's carbon market occurred on September 26, 2012, with over 40 indigenous protesters from the Lancome jungle and members of international NGOs gathered outside the governor's Climate and Forest Task Force meeting in Chiapas, Mexico. The task force, founded by the state of California, brought together government and business officials dedicated to implementing RED policies globally. They represented 16 local governments of 6 countries: Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, the United States, Peru, and Nigeria, that between them held over 20% of the world's forests. Among the most vocal protesters at the task force meeting was Ufima Sanchez, a Mayan indigenous leader from the remote jungles of Chiapas. Denied a chance to address the meeting, Sanchez seized the microphone during the opening plenary and spoke before a packed auditorium of several hundred participants. She was quoted, "We have come before you today to denounce the programs and projects that threaten to dispossess us of our territories. Why do the wealthy want to impose their will by force? The jungles are sacred and they exist to serve the people. We don't come to your countries and tell you what to do with your lands and your lives. We ask for the same respect," end quote. Ufima's rejection of offsets invoked the nature of the forest as a home, as a historically contested territory, and as a sacred space. Her intervention highlights how climate policy maps onto existing cultural meanings and social and historical dynamics concerning property and politics. For example, if we look at the protest sign at the bottom, in Spanish it reads, "The government of Chiapas is lying to us. They did not inform us, they did not consult us, and we don't want RED." Under international law, before you enter into any agreements that impact indigenous communities, there must be free, prior, and informed consent. So the allegation here, there was no free, prior, and informed consent of this global policy that California was pushing forward that was going to impact the livelihoods and lands of indigenous communities. 3 weeks later, after the Forest Task Force meeting, an international delegation of indigenous leaders from Mexico, Brazil, and Ecuador traveled to Sacramento to register their opposition in person at a California Air Resources Board hearing on October 18, 2012. The delegation was hosted by Friends of the Earth and several California environmental justice organizations. While digital communications aided the development of a South-North exchange, activists understood that physical sites of assembly were still the most effective way to collectively express resistance and challenge the dominant power. California represented the locus of power here, as it is the only local jurisdiction in the world considering RED offsets. The presence of indigenous leaders alongside California environmental justice activists, moreover, showcased a narrative of the potential South-North environmental injustice derived by California's global market-based climate change solutions. In other words, it was a symbolic reminder of the spatial and human scale impacts of carbon markets and climate change solutions. When the at this hearing, there was several environmental justice activists and, of course, indigenous rights activists that spoke out in protest against the linkage. One public health activist from Chiapas, Mexico, spoke out in opposition and presented this brochure that the state of Chiapas distributed at the 2010 Conference of the Parties that the United Nations held in Cancun, Mexico. And this brochure highlighted how, in anticipation with linkage to California's carbon market and other carbon markets throughout the world, they had removed 172 illegal groups were relocated in anticipation of linkage to this forest conservation project. So the public health indigenous activists made the allegation or claim here that California hadn't even formally adopted a program with Chiapas, and the state of Chiapas is already displacing indigenous communities from their native lands. You also had, there was also indigenous rights leader from Acre, Brazil, who also spoke in opposition. Ninoa, the president of the Federation of Unique People, also spoke in opposition. He's quoted as saying, "Indigenous people are feeling the effects of offset programs. They are resisting our way of life and our ability to access our traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering sites. For this reason, we are urging you not to accept red offsets in your trading programs," end quote. California environmental justice groups also spoke out in opposition. One group stated, "We stand with our international brothers and sisters. We believe RED programs are bad for communities internationally that are being decimated from the program, and California communities that are not receiving the benefit of local pollution reduction." When the board hearing concluded, members of the Translocal Coalition continued their lobbying efforts at the state capitol. They met with legislative leaders and presented them with a letter signed by more than 30 California-based organizations opposing RED. Following the Capitol Lobby Day, a coalition organized a no RED tour throughout Northern California. Coalition members sought to educate the public about the effects of offset programs on people living in both industrial and forest regions. The tour led to a larger policy discussion in the Capitol and news media over California's ability to monitor the integrity of international offsets in developing countries. For example, the legal scholar Alan Romo noted that any international offset program implemented in a developing country would depend on the host country or third parties for validation. Corruption at any stage, including initial reporting, verification, and monitoring, could undermine offset programs. Romo's comments, influenced by the visibility of the Translocal Coalition, further raised concerns with Capitol staff members. These included whether the state could monitor international offsets in the same manner as domestic ones. The state, unlike the federal government, lacks international authority to enforce provisions or intervene in another country's sovereignty. Several senior Capitol staff members also said that California should be cautious developing linkages where doing so could induce or exasperate human rights violations in the global south. At a RED panel I hosted in 2006 at the Yale School of Forestry, the California Air Resources Board member Dean Flores commented that regulators are walking a fine line balancing in-state political pressures with a goal of combating global climate change. He said, "Are we trying to save California or are we trying to save the world? In some sense, the answer may be both." Flores identified international forest offsets as one of the most controversial issues facing the board. He added that the Translocal Coalition has done a good job in highlighting the alleged negative aspects of offsets, and which makes it more difficult to approve the program quickly. Throughout 2012, California environmental justice advocates and indigenous leaders demonstrated how powerful network coalitions could shape environmental narratives of carbon reductions. During the next 5 years, the Translocal Coalition helped stall momentum towards adoption of an international forest offset program. Most importantly, the protests created market and political uncertainty. Today, the issue continues to be contentious and unresolved in Sacramento. And going forward, there are major challenges to implementing RED projects globally. For instance, under IPCC policy guidance and based on the science, that these forests, these trees have to be able to preserve carbon for at least 100 years. But there's major challenges in ensuring that these trees can sequester carbon for 100 years. For example, the increasing severity and intensity of wildfires, both in California, Colorado, Australia, Arizona, of course, too, and Brazil is making the likelihood of these trees to be able to sequester carbon for 100 years. Projections, the Air Resources Board had done projections of a 20% buffer to account for wildfires, but the projections did not anticipate the dramatic increases in wildfires that we're experiencing in reality. And UC Berkeley recently produced a great study on carbon offset burning that questioned if that buffer of 20% was enough. A second major issue is issue of corruptions, and particularly in Mexico with drug cartels. Drug cartels are taking over forested areas, including forest conservation projects that are set aside to conserve those forests to grow not drugs, but to actually grow in some places avocado because they have a higher value. And in one case in Michoacan, Mexico, an ecologist and a scientist who was a whistleblower to the media and to other governmental entities of the encroachment on forest reserves was quoted in a Los Angeles Times article saying, the worst case scenario is that they decide I'm making too much noise and they kill me. So here we have a case that scientists, ecologists that are being threatened with their lives because of the drug cartels and their encroachment on forest preserves. And then finally, economic and political uncertainty. We see the severity of wildfires in Brazil. And we know that the president of Brazil is a very prominent climate denier. And the recent fires that happened last year, he actually even blamed them on actor Leonardo DiCaprio, that the actor paid someone to create these fires in Brazil. This form of translocal activism is important to note that it's consistent with Margaret Keck and Catherine Shishing's research on global human rights activism. What the authors termed the boomerang pattern can be observed in the ways in which NGOs in the global south work with similar domestic groups in the global north. In the case of translocal opposition to RED, indigenous groups in Chiapas and Auckland protested their own governments, state A, to stop the development of offset programs. However, due to the relative weakness of civil society in Mexico and Brazil, meant that groups lacked sufficient power to influence their own governments and could even become targets of repression themselves, a situation diagrammed as blockage in the pattern. The groups therefore connected with California environmental organizations for help. The Global North organizations, in comparison, had greater freedoms of action and benefited from stronger civil societies. Information sharing and collaboration between regions led California environmental justice groups to protest their government, state B, to block the program. Therefore, under the boomerang model, California policymakers, perhaps not wanting to be viewed as adopting policies that could provoke human rights abuses abroad, began to slow down the process of approval of global offsets. Again, this issue has remained contentious and debated in Sacramento. Therefore, through their efforts, anti-RED activists are challenging the worldviews that are often considered valid within California's decision-making around climate change. The Translocal Coalition posed a fundamental question: who has the power to protect nature and humanity from the existential threat of climate change? The answer has emerged through various forms of conflict and collaboration. California's climate policy increasingly depends on the ways in which it incorporates marginalized voices from within the state and around the globe. So to sum up some of the key findings from this case study, the Translocal Coalition had some key findings and impact. First, it shows that distant groups formed an anti-RED campaign based on diverse worldviews, cultures, and histories. Second, environmental injustice is interconnected. Environmental justice groups travel across geographies and scales to effectively address them. And there are spatial implications of carbon markets and our climate change solutions. Third, the coalitions challenged state power in the global north and the global south, rejecting global structures that embedded environments within climate change solutions. And then finally, instead of only market-based economic climate change solutions, environmental justice groups argued for more equitable alternatives. However, there are some limitations and challenges to this translocal coalition building. The first is there's unequal power dynamics between global north and global south activists. There's divergent perspectives and priorities among Global South indigenous groups, U.S. Native American tribes, and California environmental justice groups. As I mentioned before, there are some indigenous groups that are strongly in support of RED and want to see California linkage programs, but these are largely indigenous groups that are bigger and have formal land title to their lands. And there's also U.S. Native American tribes that are strong proponents of RED projects. The Yurok tribe, which is California's largest Native American tribe, is the biggest developer of forest offsets in the entire United States. They're the first to develop forest offsets in California, and they're actively working with these larger indigenous tribes in Brazil and throughout the Global South to create a strategy to link California's carbon market to countries such as Brazil and Mexico. And not all California environmental justice groups are opposed to forest offsets. Some believe that U.S. Native American tribes should have the opportunity to develop these offsets on their own indigenous lands. A third limitation and challenge is that state and market forces might co-opt the movement. So they may greenwash and say that they're putting safeguards and social equity provisions, checking the box without really substantially engaging environmental justice groups and indigenous rights groups. And then finally, RED is an unresolved issue. It is an unresolved issue, and therefore there's difficulty sustaining these translocal coalitions over time. It takes a lot of resources, staff time, and money to maintain such coalitions. And this coalition building has been going on for over 10 years now. So what is the broader theoretical implications or policy implications of this case study and my research from my book? What am I trying to show how environmental justice groups are influencing climate change policy and science? Through my more than 10 years of research, I came to see a tension between different worldviews of climate change. Those of scientists, mainstream environmental groups, and policymakers, and those of environmental justice activists. While these worldviews are not absolute, they are generalization of the dynamics I initially observed within California, particularly between 2006 and 2012. In the first worldview, I generally saw one based on what's called utilitarianism, efforts to develop climate policy for the greatest good for the greatest number. I call this worldview carbon reductionism, an adherence to cost effectiveness and market-based solutions focused only on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions without social equity and local health considerations for the most polluted communities. Under this worldview, my research generally observed governments being judged whether their policies are cost effective and benefit the majority. So under carbon reductionism, there's a strong greenhouse gas reduction potential. And this is often done and measured in tons of CO2 equivalent, because carbon is the most abundant greenhouse gas emission in the global atmosphere. And there's this strong scientific framing around climate change, the problem, the data, and the solutions. So there's this really strong detached expertise of who can contribute to that knowledge and solutions around climate change. And those solutions are usually focused and oriented towards cost effectiveness. How can we reduce carbon emissions most cost effectively without creating major shocks to our economy and to our businesses? And this is often done through market-based solutions such as cap and trade, which I mentioned California has the third largest in the world after the European Union and China. And this cap and trade system is seen as being geographically neutral. Since carbon emissions is a global pollutant, it does not stay at the local atmosphere. It goes into the global atmosphere and mix uniformly in the atmosphere. It does not matter where you reduce carbon emissions, so long as you reach that global target. So you can do all your carbon reductions in a wealthy community such as Marin County or Beverly Hills, or you can do them all in an environmental justice community such as South Los Angeles or doesn't really matter so long as you reach that global target. And in the early years, there was just an emphasis on mitigation. How can we quickly reduce these carbon emissions? And in the early years, there wasn't much talk or resources put towards climate adaptation, adapting our environment and our communities to wildfires, sea level rise, hurricanes, and other types of heat waves and other types of impacts that are happening with our changing climate. So conversely, on the other side, the environmental justice groups generally held a moral rights-based worldview. I dubbed their worldview as climate change from the streets. a critical reevaluation of both the practice and politics of reducing carbon emissions. Their worldview considers social equity and argues that a utilitarianism approach ignores distinctions between people and the disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income communities of color. My research observed the environmental justice worldview as participatory, embodied, and experimental. For example, under climate change from the streets, on the right-hand side of the screen, there was a strong emphasis on co-benefits potential. Of course, it was focused on how do we reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse reduction mitigation strategy, but also on co-benefits, understanding that the processes that create carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, all happens for the most part from fossil fuel burning and from refineries and other types of fossil fuel combustion. And this fossil fuel burning not only creates global emissions that go into the global atmosphere, but also simultaneously creates local emission like NOx, SOx, the precursors of smog that affects people's health at the local level. So they argue for synergy and a comprehensive approach to global and local climate change and policies that linked global objectives with local public health objectives. So ensuring that they weren't siloed both scientifically and from a policy perspective. A second aspect is therefore a strong contextual framing, understanding that climate change happens in larger society, it's influenced by economic, social, and political structures, and then also valuing multiple forms of expertise, local knowledge, embodied knowledge of communities that are being exposed to a disproportionate amount of pollution. And of course, there's an emphasis on cost effectiveness, but it should not happen at the expense of social equity. That climate change should always change policy, and science should always lead with social equity, and it should not be left to be dealt with later. It should be dealt with from the outset. With that in mind, they advocate for community-based solutions at the local level, linking the local and global multi-scalar approach. And then finally, focus, of course, on that mitigation aspect, but environmental justice groups were one of the first groups in 2010 to advocate for adaptation planning, ensuring that adaptation planning did not only focus on what's called hard assets, preserving our hospitals, our police stations, our infrastructure, but also focus on adapting and safeguarding our socially vulnerable communities that are at the front lines of these climate impacts, such as wildfires, heat waves, hurricanes, and other types of impacts that these socially vulnerable communities have less resources to be able to adapt to the changing climate. You may consider these two worldviews as a simple dichotomy. However, its use is intended to highlight a critical analysis of a contentious politics of scale, economics, race, and class. And it helps us as scholars and practitioners to understand that actors involved in climate policy making are often speaking from structural locations that are worlds apart. In 2012, yet I witnessed a big change in climate policy making. It became more participatory and synergetic. Through a recurring process of conflict and collaboration, a broad range of individuals and organizations are now co-producing what climate change means. Geographer Mike Hume argues that this tension between worldviews can have a balancing, even creative impact, yielding stronger and more robust approaches to climate change policy and resolving climate change. Furthermore, worldviews are not fixed. They can transform over time. Scientific ideas and beliefs about climate change evolve together with the representations, identities, debates, and institutions that give practical effect and meaning to policies. In other words, the ways in which we conceptualize climate change don't just happen. People are behind our governments, policies, our science, and environmental values, and they can change their minds. For instance, in 2017, at a United Nations conference, the former California Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger made statements that some traditional environmentalists ascribe to the wrong climate change worldview. He insisted that climate change action should now focus more on local air pollution and their health effects. Schwarzenegger's 2017 position, however, directly contrasted with his worldview when he held public office. As California's governor, he often impeded efforts to link climate change policy with environmental justice and local public health. His changing perspective represents the broader evolution of California's thinking and conceptualization of climate change. Through such instances, we can assess the diversification of climate change in politics, tracing how scientific facts about the world are fused with social commitments. I attribute this co-productionist framework as being underscored by the narrative and embodiment. Environmental justice groups were pushing new hypotheses as well as evaluating existing ones around climate problems and solutions. They were calling for multiple ways of learning and knowing. Through my years of interviews, I observed environmental justice groups centered how they centered their work on telling stories of how their bodies bear the marks of environmental interactions. They framed their work on the human embodiment of climate change and carbon's associated co-pollutants. For them, the body is where diverse points of pollution, social stratification, and poverty intersect. I call this way of knowing and learning as climate embodiment, a concept that draws on ecofeminist studies in the field of public health. For example, environmental justice advocates in Richmond argues for a holistic understanding of the links between the infrastructural body, that is the extraction of raw materials for the construction of buildings or the refining of oil, to the contaminated human body. So in other words, we began to imagine a form of climate embodiment that represents a continuum, where the human body cannot be divorced from its environment, and environmental solutions and science cannot be isolated from the human body. So in conclusion, this embodied research represents new models of engagement with climate change policy and science that make space for alternative paradigms of environmental protection. My engagement with stakeholders since 2006 has allowed me to critically analyze how the success of climate policy in California now depends on incorporating marginalized voices and embodied perspectives from the local and global scales. So thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely talk. And then we've got some great comments and questions in the chat. But I want to start us off, because I know a lot of people have to get going, with kind of a core question that we have for all of our participants in this colloquium. As we think about the kinds of data that you've managed to collect and the ways that you're reflecting on this information, on your insights, can you direct our attention to how engineering and science might, and scientists and engineers, right? Because we all come from a place and we are all, we aren't just floating expertise, right? How we could think about being and acting in humanitarian ways, and how we might understand that kind of action better based on your findings and your insights.
Well, thank you for that question. That's such an important question. As a form of reflective practice, I teach my own students, if they're public health scholars, public health practitioners, and urban planners, or environmental practitioners in general, having a form of reflective practice, understanding the ways in which our models, our methods of how we do our work, our practice, in society, it has an impact on society and different demographic groups. So that's the first question, asking scientists, engineers, people in the STEM fields to step back and try to see what are the implications of their work, of the projects, the tools, the analyses that they're putting forward. How is their research questions, maybe bracketing out different groups, or obscuring the consequences that it may have to sensitive populations. So always asking, thinking ahead of why that research question, what sort of data are you going to use to answer that research question? And is that research question, the data you're using, going to have implications for certain sensitive populations? So that's where I think the most thoughtful, reflective practice can take place.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up with another question from our Colorado School of Mines student Perla Leon, who's working on a capstone project actually related to building customized toolkits to create climate action plans for municipalities. And she'd like to know, kind of based on your research and the work you've done for your book, could you talk a little bit about what prevents governments from mitigating emissions, and what sort of channels their choices? She's thinking particularly of how people might see a breakdown of their emissions and deal with actionable feedback, but maybe you want to respond in light of mindsets, approaches to problems.
Sure, thank you for that question. So I think it's clear that climate change is not, the problem of solving climate change is not a scientific one. There's a consensus, as we all know, it's a political one. And I started my talk also, it's a cultural one. And that's why a big theme is worldview. We all have our positionality in our worldview. And even if you're a scientist or an engineer, you have your particular worldview on which you grew up, in which the community in which you come from, that made you want to become an engineer, may have influenced you. And so we have all these unique perspectives that we bring to. So I encourage everyone to always understand that sort of their own embodied experience, their positionality, and how that influences the sort of work that they do, and the ways in which they answer the questions, the methods in which they seek to solve a problem. But political and cultural. So I think that's the biggest thing. We see that we have a strong division in this country and in many places throughout the country, that climate change as a concept disrupts our way of life, disrupts the worldview in which we relate to the environment, our society, and our economics. So if we were to do a comprehensive a plan on climate change, that is going to have implications to businesses and economic structures. And there's a lot of vested interests in that process, from our state government, from our federal governments to our state governments, and most importantly to our local governments. So that's the biggest issue. You have sides there that don't want to change the status quo. And the biggest effort in my research that I've seen is appealing to these worldviews and try to find commonality, because oftentimes you're not going to get a person to completely agree with you, particularly if you frame it around climate change. But from what I've seen and what I argue for is focusing on climate change on outcomes and making it real, making climate change real to the everyday person, to the community person, and showing how your climate change solutions is going to impact people, public health, and create jobs. So just because it's the most scientifically sound climate solution, and it's going to get us to decarbonization of society and our economy in a rapid pace, doesn't mean that it's going to be socially adopted throughout society uniformly. So that's another aspect of how can you create solutions that'll reach that sort of optimal mitigation target, but bring in more people under the tent that is supported. And places in agricultural regions in California, where the farming industry and the oil companies, because California is the third largest oil producer in the country, people forget that. So they have big influence in California. It's when you talk to legislators, you talk to local elected officials, again, focusing on real outcomes, jobs, how this is going to create more jobs, how this is going to improve public health in local communities, how it's going to improve the environmental condition. Those are some of the three key things that I've seen that have been beneficial in trying to create some commonality between these very contrasting worldviews, which there are multiple. I just showed two worldviews, but there's multiple worldviews around environmental protection paradigms.
Thank you so much. I have a question I want to frame building off of that. And it's kind of building on a question from our students, Larkin Martini and Nick Yurovsky, who ask about the sort of questions about political self-determination of local communities, especially in places where people might orient towards climate change in different ways. They wonder if you could explore, for example, what happens when in places where climate change is denied. You brought that up a little bit. I'd love to hear you explore a little bit more.
No, that's great. I think self-determination is key. One of the key tenets of environmental justice is for them to speak for themselves, for the communities to speak for themselves, and I think that goes for any community. And again, making climate change more relatable, focusing on outcomes. And we all heard of that tired trope during the everyone I'm sure still remembers who Vice President Al Gore is, right? And I hope you do. And he was one of the proponents, policymakers that was really on the bandwagon about climate change. And this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And an old trope would be save the polar bear. So I'm sure people might have heard that old trope. It's retired now because it has been played out. And climate deniers and even people that are more moderate really said, I don't care. I don't care about the polar bear. I care about people dying in my own community, people that are unemployed, people that are dying from asthma and other respiratory diseases. Why are you focusing? Why should we pass this controversial legislation that's going to disrupt my way of life? It's going to take away working class jobs at the oil refinery or at the power plant. Why? I don't care about those ecosystems or the forests. And I think as my research and other researchers have shown, as you focus it more on outcomes, and you were able to acknowledge the concerns of that opposing interest group that are concerned, their concerns, and acknowledging them, and being able to show tangibly and concretely or directly how climate changes can affect their local community. That has been the biggest lever to change and get people to support climate change, or in these areas that have climate-like policies, they just call it sustainability. So that's been another strategy that these communities are just doing sustainability. We're doing sustainability policy. We're not doing climate change. And is it climate change? Is it climate change policy if you don't call it climate change policy? But the end goal is the same or somewhat the same. So that's another political strategy that we see in other places.
All right, I have one more question for you. We've been staying a little bit longer, but this is so fascinating. But I think this is the question that we want to close up on. And I want to focus us on a question that comes from Juliana Valenzuela and Haley, who's Haley Glover, who ask about individual action. And a lot of your the talk you're doing here is, even in your local scale, we're talking about local communities, local cities. I wonder if you might be willing to reflect a little bit on individual action and how we might be advocates, how we might hold organizations, cities, corporations accountable, and how we can focus our impact. How do you see that?
That my book kind of says in the title, "Climate Change from the Streets." I think social movements are key to any kind of any type of major change in society. In particular, we saw this recently in the recent elections of how places like Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, how local social movements have made the difference in the outcome of the election. And this was a long process that these community groups have been organizing for years and been working on towards a goal of having a more equitable society and a person that an office that valued social justice and climate change, of course, and among other things. So it's also important to understand as people in the STEM fields that you're used to creating these very scientifically sound, economically viable type of models and analyses. And often, and there's been instances that scientists have also teamed up with social movements too and created these very scientifically sound plans. But those plans will never be adopted without some level of or form of exercise of power. So you can have the most scientifically sound and valid plan out there, but it has to be connected to some exercise of power. And oftentimes is this through social movements, through protests, having an inside-outside game of having protesters outside the White House, outside City Hall, outside the state legislature, and also making sure that our governments, our institutions, our elected officials, our regulators, our scientists working within our state departments of the environment or at the U.S. EPA, that they're very representative of the diversity of the United States and represent people that understand these equity and environmental justice dimensions. So local organizing, no matter whatever cause that you want for social justice, is key. And the case studies that I've done in the book and in other journal articles, social movements are at the center of these larger transformative changes in governments and policies.
Thank you so much. What great words to end on. Social movements are at the center. So thank you all for coming. I will share this recording. Take a look at Dr. Michael Méndez's book. It is a lovely thing and it is available. I put a link in the chat. Have a lovely night, everyone. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.